Pablo, please, welcome. Tell us, what does this look like from your angle? How do you see the green transition, and specifically from an energy point of view?
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Aurora, and thanks to Sustecable for putting this on. So I'm sitting here in Houston, Texas. It considers itself the energy capital, certainly of the United States, if not of the world. And the region is really struggling with how we're going to meet this transition, facilitate this transition in the energy economy, and just continue to be a leader. So that's something we can talk more about later. But I wanted to focus a little bit about the Mexico angle and the binational angle as it plays, a role in North America. Since 2008, Mexico and the United States have really increased their energy trade. In 2020, it was about $47 billion. Most of that was, it was $13 billion in U.S. imports from Mexico, primarily crude oil. And then that export, the remainder, some $34 billion, is natural gas and petroleum products. That was not always the case. And that has been increasing significantly. From 2014 to 2018, Mexico really tried to open up its energy sector that had been closed off and nationalized since 1938. They invited private sector investment in the oil and gas sector. A lot of U.S. companies, some European companies as well, were interested in there. Unfortunately, since 2018, when the current president took office, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, we call him AMLO, he really has tried to reverse those reforms. He's taken an argument of being more protecting the state company, Pemex, and the electric company, CFE. And this really is to the detriment, many argue, and I would argue, to the Mexican economy, to our climate change goals, to Mexico's climate change goals, and to the benefit of Mexico in the long term. So I would say, in terms of Mexico's oil future, and Mexico is super dependent on oil. They get, in 2020, about 58%, I think, of their revenue from oil. They produce about 1.9 billion barrels per day, and that has been decreasing since 2004. They need major investments to keep that going if they want to depend on that. And the current president is kind of shunning some of that foreign investment. Pemex is heavily burdened by debt and doesn't have the resources to transition. Beyond that, Mexico is really, the current president has really discouraged clean energy investment. A lot of that investment was coming from the United States in terms of solar, wind, and now there's a bit of uncertainty there. Some recent movements in the Senate have reaffirmed the rights of private sector to invest in Mexico energy. But the president is taking some administrative actions to really slow the permitting process, slow the movement of funds, slow the approvals. So it's really sending mixed signals. That's not sustainable for Mexico. So it's unclear, where that's going to go in the future. But right now, Mexico is very much dependent on natural gas from the United States. It's very much dependent on gasoline from the United States. Its refineries right now are not capable of producing the gasoline to meet their demand. So how this is going to play out is still a bit uncertain, and we're in a bit of time of transition.
And if we look at the transition into renewables or fossil-free energy in the hopefully a future energy mix that looks different from the picture that you just painted, how would you describe the current landscape, the willingness, the drive to try new things, iterate, innovate, scale up, do testing, invest in maybe foreign companies or local producers? Is this exciting? Is this something that will happen later on? Is this something we're worried about? What's the mood?
Definitely exciting. It's definitely happening. It's not happening at the scale that it needs to happen if we're going to meet our climate goals, right? And that's the reality. Texas brought online over 7,000 megawatts of new wind and solar last year. That's more than any other state in the United States. That's about 2.5, almost 3 times the amount of California. And that's at the same time that Texas continues to be by far the state with the most oil and gas production in the United States. So we are growing.
Could you give us that in a percentage, Pablo?
Percentage of what?
Of the total energy consumed?
I don't know. I'll look it up while we're talking. But in terms of solar and wind, still plays a very small amount of the amount of electricity in the United States. So I think we're about 20% nationally renewables. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimated with our current policies, that's without any changes, we would barely get to about 45% renewables by 2050. Clearly, that's not enough. That's not going to meet our target of 2035, being carbon neutral with electricity, and it's not going to meet our carbon neutral goal. So we're not doing enough. So solar, wind is growing, but not at the rate that it needs to. And I would argue that kind of a missing piece in all of this is the role of natural gas in the transition. Longer term, natural gas is not going to be carbon neutral unless we change the technology significantly. But in the short to medium term, as we see coal consumption increasing globally, not in the United States, but globally, I would rather be seeing these countries get their energy from natural gas than from coal. And we're sending very mixed signals to the market, to the oil and gas markets, I would argue.
Let's stop there a little, because I think that's an important point. And you guys are in this, you live this every day, so this means something to you. But we have an audience of potentially investors who are starting to understand the lingo. And it's not that easy to decipher the media landscape. This is good, this is bad, this is important, this needs to be scaled up. Like, why aren't we talking about this specific switch and the timeline that this means in the transition?
Well, I have a perspective, Pablo? And then I'm sure Charles has something to say. The narrative that that governments like to use is that we can put some money towards this, and it's going to be a transition that will sort of take care of itself. And my mantra is the energy transition is not going to be easy, fast, or cheap. The energy transition is going to be long, difficult and expensive.
Messy.
Yeah. And so I think it's important that folks who are involved in this sector, whether they're on the capital side, and if you've ever heard Mark Carney speak about the need for private capital to fill the gap, governments don't have enough money to make this transition. You need $1 trillion a year just in infrastructure investments, starting a decade ago to really make a shift. And I think what we have to have is people speaking more frankly about the enormous challenge that we're facing, and we have to face it like a challenge that requires across the board social, financial capital, changes. So that's my screed right now. This is a challenge because the messages of political leadership and the message we see in a lot of mainstream media suggest that this is just something that's naturally going to happen. As Pablo, you pointed out, there's transition fuels that are absolutely essential, and let's talk about hydrogen and natural gas in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, from my perspective, I've worked with hundreds of companies trying to go into the U.S. and help them get settled there in the energy space. And I know that the U.S., having lived in Austria, France, and also Germany in Europe, I know a little bit, nothing much about Sweden, but I know a little bit about Europe. And I do see that, there's nowhere that I've been on Earth, and I've been in over 60 countries working, where I see the rule of law and the investment, the money, where the capital, investment meets the market. And like Bud was saying, I personally would not want government to put all the money, because governments, a lot of the money sometimes gets, in DC we called it, the Beltway bandits. It gets kind of not funneled in the right direction. And so you want that capital and that private sector. And so if there would be, and personally, I'm also like you, an angel investor, and having invested in Canada and the US, my investments, everything I've done in the US has paid off more. I'm sorry for Canada. I'm a Canadian too, so it saddens me personally. but I have to look at my ROE and ROI, and investing in the US has been really a great experience for me.
And let's continue on that point. But first, I want to tell our audience that we have a Slido, which means an opportunity for you to ask the panel questions. So it's up in the right-hand corner. So just ask any questions, and I will hopefully remember to check. And Miriam, you will remind me. So take the opportunity.